Bibliophiles of the internet, somehow the first month of 2026 is already behind us, which means it's time for me to share my January wrap-up. January was certainly a month. It should go without saying, but around these parts, it is, always has been, and always will be, fuck ICE, fuck borders, and fuck the systemic dehumanization of immigrants. In terms of my reading, at least, I feel like I got a pretty good start to 2026. I have a lot of really great books to discuss. I did get somewhat sidetracked from the TBR I had planned when we started the month. Lots of spontaneous and spur-of-the-moment reading choices were certainly made, but I still somehow read 14 books, so let's just get started. If you've been here for the past few years, you know I have a very specific tradition when it comes to picking out the first book of the year. I have adopted this tradition of starting the year by reading a queer World War I book, and every year I've done it so far, those books have gone on to become favorite books of the year. So as silly as it might sound, this year was actually no different. So for that reason, the first book I read to start 2026 was Alec by William DeCanzio, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by John Sackville. This is basically the unofficial sequel to E.M. Forster's classic novel Morris, but instead the story is told from the perspective of Alec Scudder, the gamekeeper whom Morris falls in love with. So this book follows the two lovers past the end of Morris to the front lines of World War I and beyond, and explores whether their secret love will be strong enough to endure a world that's been radically changed by war and destruction. Content warnings for references to infant death, experienced classism, some expressions of racism and colorism, experienced and internalized homophobia, some non-graphic references to suicide, graphic depictions of violence, war, and war-related trauma, including starvation, dehydration, and suicidal thoughts, references to off-page animal death, some internalized ableism and ableist language, and some explicit sexual content. I am so happy with all the choices my past self made so that this could be the first book I read in 2026. And I'm really glad I took the time to read the source material Morris before diving into this. This is one of those cases where I don't think being familiar with the original text is a requirement in order to appreciate and understand what the book is doing, so I don't think not knowing takes anything away, but I do think having that context adds a richness to the experience. I have such a deep respect for the project of this novel because Forster originally completed the manuscript for Morris in 1913 when London was on the brink of being pulled into World War I, and he famously struggled with whether he wanted to include an epilogue or not. He wrote and rewrote the ending countless times because he really wanted the characters to be together, but with the uncertainty of looming war, he couldn't even begin to imagine what that shared future might look like. So for William DeCanzio to take up the pen, so to speak, more than a century after that book's completion, with the gift of hindsight as to how the war actually played out and actually impacted the British, feels like a tremendous act of care and love. You can really feel how much care has been put into this continuation, especially with how it expands on the characters, how it imagines the ways that war complicated their relationship, and also how brilliantly it walks the line between being realistic about the characters' circumstances while still honoring Forster's vision for the story and what it's working towards. You can tell that Morris means something to the author, that it played a profound role in his own journey as a queer man, and I just really appreciate the author building off the original work in incredibly thoughtful ways so as to spark the hearts and imaginations of entirely new audiences. So this is an incredibly beautiful and yes, at times harrowing continuation of Morris and Alec's love story, and I think thematically it really helped me to understand why I find queer World War I fiction and history so compelling, which is that it speaks to how queer people especially are literally fighting to create a world we can live in and exist safely within, but then so often when we finally reach the other side, the fight has taken so much from us that we can't even recognize the worlds that we've built for ourselves. That's really what the characters are grappling with in this story. They have fought so hard to protect themselves and their relationship, both from the eyes of the law and through the impossible violence of war, and yet when it seems like they might finally be able to be together, they're no longer the people they once were when they first fell in love. But even so, the story is about how love is still worth fighting for, how having the people we love with us, even if they might be battered and broken and changed, is better than not having them at all. And it's worth it to see what might be on the other side, even if getting there isn't easy to begin with. I just thought this was a really wonderful story, written with such emotional clarity, thoughtfulness, and lyricism. It was exactly what I hoped it would be, and also so much more, and in the end I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I spontaneously picked up the audiobook for There's Always Next Year by Leah Johnson and George M. Johnson. I was given access to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, and it's read by Eric Lockley and Kaya Freites. This is a dual POV YA contemporary story about two queer black teens, Andy and Dominique, who are also cousins. Dominique is a huge influencer with a growing platform who's on the verge of landing a major brand deal that could support his family for quite some time, but his career has actually taken him away from his family and his hometown, so he and Andy have kind of lost touch. But when his work brings him back home for a few days around New Year's, it presents an opportunity for the two of them to try and reconnect. But Andy is also an aspiring journalist who happens to have what could be a major story about the effects of gentrification in their small town sitting on a flash drive in her car, but she gets a bit too drunk at a New Year's party and her car gets stolen as a prank. So this is one of those one bizarre day stories where it's just one thing after another conspiring to keep these two characters apart. Content warnings for references to parent death and grief, explorations of gentrification, as well as some experienced racism and depictions of systemic racism. This was a really fun listen. I especially enjoyed the audiobook experience. These two narrators were new to me, but they were incredibly charismatic and personable. I think they did a great job of capturing the voiciness of both perspectives. Both of these authors are great at crafting distinctive, unique voices, and I think the audiobook really brought that to life. I do also enjoy whirlwind stories like this where it's just one thing after another, a never-ending series of shenanigans and mishaps, and I think that momentum was definitely one of the story's biggest strengths. I also appreciate what this story is doing thematically. It's not just a fun, cheeky holiday story, but it actually has something meaningful to say about the violence of gentrification and interrogating what role we might play in accepting or normalizing gentrification, whether we realize it or not. We might not be the ones making the choices about how our communities are changing, but we might knowingly or unknowingly be paving the way or giving unspoken permission for those changes to take place with our passivity or our complacence. Because it's a New Year story, there's also some worthwhile discussion about this idea that we have to completely reinvent ourselves with the new year, that the only way for us to grow forward is to completely let go of the past. And the story is kind of pushing back against that, reminding us that it's our past selves who have gotten us to where we are in the world, that becoming something shiny and new isn't automatically becoming something better. In fact, keeping our roots strong and knowing where we come from is what actually makes us better to begin with. And of course, that ties in really nicely with the commentary on gentrification as well. That said, I think there were a few places this story could have been stronger. The romantic storylines in both perspectives were a bit lacking in my opinion, just because it's really hard to build out a meaningful relationship over the span of a single day. I also wanted more connection and more overlap between the two perspectives. It just takes a little bit too long for the two narrative threads to finally connect. But I thought this was still solid, and I appreciated bringing something different to the table, especially as a holiday story. So in the end, I gave this 4 stars. After that, I spontaneously listened to my ALC of I'm So Happy You're Here, a celebration of library joy, written by Michael Threets and illustrated by Lorraine Naum. PRH Audio kindly granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by the author himself, and this book recently released on February 3rd. Michael Threets is an incredibly popular librarian and literacy ambassador. You might also know him as the new host of Reading Rainbow. He really made a name for himself on TikTok and has since gone on to do a lot of advocacy work on behalf of libraries across the country. This is his debut picture book, which is all about sharing the wonderful resources, spaces, and stories that can be found at your local library, and celebrating how libraries are for everyone. I don't have too much to say about this, I just thought it was really wonderful. It's kind of interesting to review a picture book that I solely consumed as an audiobook, but I think if the artwork even remotely matches the quality of the narrative, then it's going to be something really special. I just found this to be such a lovely book. It's a really thoughtful, expansive look at why libraries are such important fixtures in the community, what kinds of resources can be found there, and why library joy is so important for everyone to be able to experience. This would also be a really great audiobook to listen to in tandem with the physical book, especially if you're reading it with younger children, because there are some really great sound effects and production effects that really bring the story to life. Libraries are so important now more than ever, and I love that this book is sharing that message, encouraging folks of all ages to engage with their library and really make the most of that space. There was really nothing about this I didn't like, so it was an easy 5 stars. On a very different note, after that I decided to read When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. This is a dark, twisted horror story about a struggling actress named Jess who's already having a night from hell when she discovers a 5-year-old runaway hiding in the bushes outside her apartment. And after a violently gruesome encounter with the kid's father, she and the child find themselves desperately running for their lives. Content warnings for some allusions to child abuse, graphic depictions of injury, violence, gore, and dead bodies, some instances of massacre and mass death, some body horror, references to parental estrangement and parent death, some depictions of drug abuse and misuse, as well as some other graphic medical content. This is a merciless gut punch of a story. It's a whirlwind that left me breathless more often than not and is horrifyingly compelling in the sense that it's almost impossible to look away from the story as it careens into a fully off-kilter fever pitch. At the end of the day, this is a gruesome, violent horror story that moves a mile a minute and is doing some really interesting things as it blends together elements of horror and fantasy. It also explicitly pays homage to The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I have not read, but now I really want to. So it really does feel like a bizarre, unending nightmare brought to life. And yes, there are definitely ways this story could have been written better. There are a few moments here and there where you can tell this is a young female character very much written by a man. But even with that in mind, I think Nat Cassidy is able to really land the plane because of the story's incredibly strong thematic work. At its heart, I think this story is really about the phenomenon of shapeshifting and how we as people shapeshift throughout our lives out of necessity as they progress, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. There's so much in here about how parents are shapeshifters, how having children fundamentally changes a person, and how parents are constantly grappling with the question of how to protect their children in a ruthless world where no one comes out unscathed. No one escapes being changed or hurt by the world. It's asking the question of how we protect other people when we don't even know how to protect ourselves, when we might be the very thing that other people need protecting from. How do we grapple with the fact that we often teach the next generation how to fear before we teach them how to hope? But it's also very much about how we give power to fear when we allow fear to be the shapeshifter, to have the ability to morph into anything at any time, to be this faceless, infinite force casting a shadow over every inch of our lives. Is there a way for us to live with our fear, to reserve fear for when it's needed, instead of letting it consume us? So there's a lot of really great ideas and questions here that I really appreciate. And on top of that, the story is also high octane, fast paced, and pushing the envelope creatively. So primarily for those reasons, I gave this 4.5 stars. Then I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, and for January, my patrons voted for me to read Son of the Morning by Akweke Emezi. And even though this came out last year, I listened to my ALC provided by Libro FM, and the audiobook is read by Indigo Brown. This is Akweke Emezi's first adult paranormal romance. It's about a woman named Galilee who's been raised by a formidable clan of magical black women sequestered deep in the South. And all her life, she's had this feeling that she's different, but she can't really explain why that is. Until she meets Lucifer himself, disguised as the head of security for one of Galilee's wealthy friends. And the moment they come into contact, he knows that she is definitely not human, and she might also have some kind of literal power over him. Content warnings for some graphic references to death, torture, and violence, brief references to past experiences of sexual violence with a secondary character, brief mentions of infertility and miscarriage also with a secondary character, and explicit sexual content. I'll start by saying that I wasn't blown away by this. I really wanted to be. I was really hoping that Akweke Emezi would bring something new and fresh to the steamy paranormal romance space, but I found a lot of this to be very tired, very cliche, and for me I found that the spicy parts of this book, as fun as they were, just ended up overshadowing everything else. This is one of those insta-lust situations where the characters bang first, ask questions later, which is totally fine, but for me, it just never progressed past that. And what's wild is that there are some really interesting fantasy plot points, but they're completely ignored and sidelined until almost the very end, when it ends up feeling too little too late. The other problem for me is that this is one of those fantasy books where people stand around and talk at each other for like 90% of the book, which I personally just don't find interesting or exciting. There's not a lot of plot movement, literal or otherwise, and I just think it really skews the stakes of the story, because there are stakes in theory, but not so much in practice. So overall, I was left pretty lukewarm with this one, which was somewhat disorienting, seeing as how I've really enjoyed some of Akweke's work in the past, and there's certainly much more from them I still want to read. This is just one of those cases where the book is simply not for me, and that's okay. I did enjoy the biblical edge to the fantasy elements, especially how they were twisted to fit the story, and I also think the relationship dynamic between the main trio is the most compelling part of the book. There's some really interesting ideas about fluidity in terms of how power and surrender are exchanged in that relationship, which I did find pretty fascinating. So credit where credit is due, but for me this was still a 3-star book, and that might even be a little bit generous. Then after watching and really enjoying the film adaptation, I decided to give People We Meet on Vacation a chance. Romance. This is written by Emily Henry, and I was granted access to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Julia Whalen. This is an adult friends to lovers romance about two college best friends, Poppy and Alex, who first met because they happened to be from the same small town in Ohio, but they also couldn't be more different. Alex is super straight-laced and disciplined. He's a homebody who doesn't like to draw too much attention to himself, while Poppy, on the other hand, is very outgoing and eccentric. He's an English teacher at the same high school he graduated from. She's a travel writer who jets all around the world and basically gets paid to take vacations. So they have this pact where once a year, no matter where they are in life or how far apart they might be, they take a trip together. And it's been their favorite thing to do until their latest trip, when something might have happened that could potentially jeopardize their friendship. Content warnings for mentions of parent death and grief, references to past experiences of bullying, some mentions of drug use, brief allusions to animal death, and some sexual content. This was my first time reading from Emily Henry, and while I can already tell you that I'm not going to be reading all of her books, I did really enjoy both this book and the movie adaptation. I am a staunch forever defender of the rom-com. I think it's a lost art form that's not always appreciated the way it should be, and this story just made me feel like I was transported back to the true blue rom-com era at its peak. This story absolutely delivers on both the rom and the com, in my humble opinion. I think some of the marketing material likens the dynamic of this couple to Luke and Lorelai from Gilmore Girls, which at first I thought was kind of a stretch, but now I see where they were going with that comparison, and I think it actually makes a lot of sense. The banter between these characters is lightning fast. It moves a mile a minute. They're also the kinds of friends who really commit to the bit and keep the same joke running far past its expiration date, which I personally find to be endearing when played in the right way, and I do think the story does play it in the right way. The pacing of the romantic arc is also exactly my preferred speed. The slow burn yearning across years and years and years is absolutely my jam. This is authentically slow burn romance in its purest form. The friends to lovers aspect of the story isn't just a trope or a cutesy tagline, it's an integral part of the story, and being able to see that gradual progression over such a long period of time really makes the romantic payoff that much more gratifying, in my opinion. I also really enjoyed how the story was structured, how it's grounded in the present day when Poppy and Alex aren't necessarily on the best of terms, and then takes us back year by year through their friendship and the vacations they've taken together, all the way from the beginning until the past finally catches up to present day. So all in all, I just thought this was really fun, emotional yet lighthearted. The characters are delightfully entertaining and endearing. That may not be a universal experience depending on your sense of humor, but for me, it really worked. There is a bit of emotional dishonesty on display that I'm not sure is successfully or fully grappled with, but that's really the only negative I can think of. I would still give this 4.5 stars. Then I decided to pick up my arc of Dogs, Boys, and Other Things I've Cried About by Isabel Klee, which comes out from William Morrow on April 28th. Isabel is a legend in the pet foster space, and she's definitely built a huge platform for herself on social media, especially TikTok, where she documents a lot of extreme medical foster cases. This memoir is about how she found herself in New York City, how she started working with animals, and how all of that ultimately intertwined with and underscored her journey to finding love and finding herself. Content warnings for some explorations of toxic romantic relationships, including manipulation and experienced infidelity, some descriptions of drunkenness and illness, reflections on animal injury, animal cruelty, animals with chronic and terminal illness, and animal death, some explorations of the COVID pandemic, and brief references to anxiety and mental illness. I'm not one who's easily convinced to pick up books written by quote-unquote influencers, which I don't even think is the right term for what Isabel does, even though she does have a significant social media following, but you can tell just from the voiceovers on her videos that she is a writer, and a pretty damn good one too, and that's why I was sold on giving this one a try. And wouldn't you know it, she did study creative writing in college, and again, I think it really shows. I just think Isabel is a really beautiful soul. You can tell she's very grounded in her purpose, she's very mindful and empathetic, she uses her platform for good, and I think all of those aspects of her personality really shine through in this book. I really love how she's able to braid together these pieces of her journey towards finding love, finding independence, while also cataloging what each of her foster dogs has meant to her and taught her about life and about herself. Even though it shouldn't be, it feels incredibly organic and natural for those topics to go together. Each piece really lends itself to the others, and I think structurally the memoir is pieced together in a way that makes a lot of sense. I also think it's written in such a way that feels really intimate and vulnerable, but also gentle at the same time. It's really about how wanting to be loved, wanting to be cared for in a world that can be incredibly cruel and isolating is truly a universal experience that even transcends species. And of course, more than anything, this is a really beautiful love letter to dogs and to all the joy they bring to our lives. How they have this indelible instinct just to live and to love, even when living and loving doesn't make much sense, and how there's so much we can learn from them in that respect. This was a genuinely beautiful, moving, incredibly personal memoir. It's even more impressive when you consider that writing a memoir as a relatively young person can be such a challenge, but I think Isabel did such a great job honing in on a very specific time in her life and tying that together with her work. It does feel like a debut at times. There's a bit of repetition or instances where the sentence structure could have been varied a little bit more, but I would still highly recommend this, and I gave it 4.25 stars. After that, I was detoured by Heated Rivalry, which it turns out I am not immune to. So after watching the show, I decided to read the 2 Shane and Ilya books in the Game Changer series, and only those 2 books, which were Heated Rivalry and The Long Game by Rachel Reed. I listened to the audiobooks for both, the first of which is read by Tor Tom, and the other is read by Cooper North. I'm going to try to talk about these 2 together, but if you somehow don't know, Heated Rivalry is a queer romance about 2 hockey superstars at the top of their game. They're the top 2 draft picks for the NHL, they're super talented, and even though they have this very public rivalry between them, they also might be sleeping together behind closed doors. I thought there would be more to explain, but that's pretty much it. Content warnings for Heated Rivalry include references to a parent with dementia, parental death due to illness, and also suicide, explorations of grief, experienced homophobia, including homophobic remarks and slurs, some details of graphic sports injury, and explicit sexual content. Content warnings for The Long Game include some depictions of anxiety and depression, some descriptions of extreme dieting, and some potentially disordered eating habits, non-graphic references to suicide and suicide ideation, allusions to parental death and grief, experienced racism and homophobia, instances of public outing, references to alcohol abuse with a side character, non-graphic references to sexual assault with side characters, and explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, Shane is gay and Japanese Canadian, and Ilya is a bisexual Russian immigrant. Firstly, now that I've consumed the story in both mediums, I can confidently say that the TV series is an incredibly faithful adaptation. So much of the book Heated Rivalry is in the show beat for beat, line for line. So if you really enjoy the show, you will most likely enjoy the books and vice versa. It's hard to think about what there is to say about this series that hasn't already been said. I don't think it's a perfect series by any means, and there are definitely critiques to be made, especially by cis gay men, which I think we should always take seriously when it comes to romance. But even with that in mind, there's something about this romance that I find to be quietly tender and even healing in some ways. There's really no way to dance around the fact that this series is basically smut, and that's not me putting it down, that's not a value judgment of any kind, it's just calling a spade a spade. But there's a really interesting interplay between shame and pleasure that we can only really get to through those overtly explicit sexual moments, and that's where I think the heart of the story really is. I was telling one of my friends that I feel like Heated Rivalry and Heartstopper are 2 extreme ends of the same spectrum. If Heartstopper is a wholesome, heartwarming story about finding love and finding yourself, then Heated Rivalry is also exploring that same trajectory, but in a way that's obviously much raunchier and much more adult. I just love Shane's journey, especially the way he starts the series as being so afraid, so self-conscious, so tightly controlled to the point of breaking, and how he takes a leap of faith with Ilya by doing something that could potentially end his career if discovered, but the experience of surrendering that control is so profound that he can't bring himself to stop. Again, there's a lot about this series that I don't have the time or expertise to fully unpack, but again, I think it's really about shifting our perspective on what is shameful and what's not. There's something very liberating about how the series depicts sex and intimacy and closeness, showing us that sex is not shameful, queerness is not shameful, even wanting to keep things just for yourself is not something to be ashamed of. It's the stigma, it's the powers that be that twist our fear until it becomes an obstacle to our own happiness. Even just thinking about how the story transitions from stealthy, stolen nighttime hookups to these 2 characters loving each other out loud and in the light is a really beautiful, powerful thing. I also appreciate how Heated Rivalry specifically is a story told on a very small scale. It's not about these two characters becoming rainbow activists or making themselves into queer mascots for a sports league that ultimately does not support them. It's about their own personal journeys to accepting themselves and accepting that their relationship is so much different than what they first thought. With The Long Game, I think story-wise, I actually enjoyed it even more than Heated Rivalry. The characters are a bit more established, a bit further in their careers. They're not these young players jockeying for recognition or accolades. There's a bit more domesticity and ease between them that I really enjoyed reading. But I do think there are a couple of moments and plot points here and there that are a bit unnecessary, maybe even borderline manipulative in terms of storytelling. There were some difficult things the characters had to go through that I don't think were inevitable in the conceit of the story, and that I also think deserved a bit more nuance. So I could see a bit more of the puppet master pulling the strings in that sense. So ultimately, I gave Heated Rivalry 4.25 stars and The Long Game 4 stars. And no, I do not have any plans to read any of the non-Shane and Ilya books in the series, with respect. After I got that out of my system, I picked up Starling House by Alec Harrow. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Natalie Naudis. This is a blend of horror and fantasy. The story is set in a small Kentucky town that's notable for only two things. One, the town seems to be cursed by bad luck, and two, it's the birthplace of E. Starling, a reclusive 19th century author who mysteriously vanished over a century ago. The main character, Opal, is an orphan, a high school dropout, and a full-time cynic whose sole purpose is to take care of her younger brother Jasper and save up enough money to get him into a private school and out of town for good. Since childhood, Opal has been obsessed with E. Starling's famous fairy tale, The Underland. So when the doors of the old Starling mansion unexpectedly open themselves to her and she gets a chance to become the house's caretaker as a way to earn some extra cash, she simply cannot refuse the call of the house. Content warnings for explorations of parental death by car accident and grief, some depictions of alcohol abuse, instances of graphic violence, injury, and blood, allusions to racism and racist slurs, references to slavery and anti-indigenous violence, allusions to child abuse experienced by a secondary character, brief mentions of forced incest experienced by a secondary character, and some sexual content. As you may know, I read my first Alec Harrow stories last year. I read The Six Deaths of the Saint and The Everlasting, both of which absolutely blew my mind. And it made me seriously question why I've been knowingly sleeping on Alec Harrow's work for years at this point. So I've decided we have to fix that in 2026. Starling House proved to me that what I felt after reading The Everlasting was definitely not a fluke. Alec Harrow is an incredibly masterful talent, and even though there's very little stylistic overlap between The Everlasting and Starling House, they both really pack a punch. What I loved most about this story was definitely the characters. They're dynamic, they're distinctive, they're emotionally volatile, and that's exactly how I like them. I'm a sucker for stories about deeply lonely people finding other deeply lonely people and realizing that they don't have to be alone. They can break down their walls, they can lay down their weapons, they can lean on someone else when they get weary, and that's exactly what this book is. Not only is this story compelling in a conceptual sense, in the sense that there's an imaginative, fantastical idea propelling the story forward, but the way that concept ties into the story's thematic work is what I find most impressive. This is a story about two characters who are just fighting to survive in more ways than one, who are not living so much as barely getting by, and who constantly feel the need to martyr themselves for the sake of protecting the people and the things they care about the most, with absolutely no regard for themselves. And it's really about them realizing that they can't stop the world from coming in, no matter how hard they try to hold the line. It's about them reckoning with the fact that protecting the things and people you love doesn't always mean shielding them from the bad things or taking hits on their behalf so that they don't have to feel the hurt. Protecting people also looks like giving people the tools they need to face the hard things themselves, being honest with people and affording them the dignity to make their own choices. It's giving someone else the chance to pick up the sword when we fall down so that someone can fight back against the darkness. And that idea of facing the darkness, naming it for what it is, not turning away from it or trying to shut it out, is also a key thematic undercurrent in the story. And there's a sort of condemnation for this small town that's turned the other way in the face of so many crimes and so many forms of injustice over generations, which it ultimately has to reckon with in the end. I do think there are aspects of that particular element that could have been pushed even further, but even with that in mind, this book absolutely eviscerated me. It somehow walks this fine line between whimsy and tragedy, fatalism and hope, which is so hard to do. So in the end, I gave it a solid 4.5 stars. Around the same time, I was also reading my arc of If All the Stars Go Dark by S.G. Prince, which recently came out from Henry Holt Books for Young Readers on January 20th. This is a queer sci-fi adventure about an orphan named Keller whose dream of joining the Legion's most prestigious galactic unit is finally coming true. The problem is his new partner, the beautiful no-nonsense pilot Lament, wants nothing to do with him and refuses to even let him board his ship. What Keller doesn't realize is that Lament is still grieving the loss of his last gunner, who also happened to be his best friend, and who was tragically killed in an inexplicable accident. But as Keller and Lament are forced to work together under Legion orders, they begin investigating a self-proclaimed prophet who claims he can use technology to predict upcoming catastrophes. And this mysterious visionary and his secretive technology might just be connected to Lament's accident as well as Keller's past. Content warnings for some explorations of child abandonment, references to death and grief, some depictions of injury, and some thematic violence. I had a lot of fun with this. I love a queer sci-fi adventure helmed by a ragtag group of underdog misfits, and that's exactly what this is. I also really enjoy a good sci-fi romance. That's not a subgenre of romance we get to have nearly as much as we should, and I appreciate how the sci-fi plot of the story is not just background noise or set dressing for the romance. This is very much a sci-fi book with a strong romantic subplot, and not the other way around. I think the book is also structured and paced really effectively. You get thrown into the action right away, and it's just non-stop from the very first page. The chapters are also super short, which makes it really easy to fly through. It's easy to tell yourself you're just going to read one more chapter, and then before you know it, it's been 50 pages. I also think the relationship between Keller and Lament is really wonderful, really dynamic. They have great banter and great chemistry, and they just truly epitomize what it means to have a slow burn, yearning forward romance between two queer fools who are geniuses in their respective fields, but absolutely clueless and hopeless when it comes to love. The constant push and pull between the two of them honestly had me giggling and kicking my feet at times, but it's also not just fun and games for these two characters. There's also a strong emotional parallel between the two of them when it comes to bringing their walls down and remembering what it feels like to trust. Thematically, I think the story is doing some interesting things, especially in how it's interrogating our relationship to technology and technological advancements that we don't fully understand. How much trust do we and should we put into these imperfect technologies? But also, how do we strike the right balance between optimism and skepticism without leaning too far in either direction? To be honest, I do think the story kind of falls apart plot-wise towards the end, just because it's setting up something really big and taking some really big swings, but then it also has to quickly wrap up a lot of complex story threads before the end because it's supposed to be a standalone and not a series. I think there was definitely enough meat on the bones for this to be a series starter, but I also know that publishers don't often hand out multi-book deals to debut authors who are quote-unquote untested and unproven. So who's to say what the original intention was, but I would have happily read another book or two with these same characters. But even with that in mind, I still thought this was a solid sci-fi debut with a ton of heart, and I gave it 4 stars. I know we've talked about so many things already, but if you can believe it, I also read my e-galley of Espiritu by Aidan Thomas, which comes out from Fievel and Friends on September 8th. This is the highly anticipated sequel to Cemetery Boys. It's another queer YA paranormal adventure, and while the POV does go back and forth between the two main characters, it's mostly told from Julian's perspective. We met Julian as a spirit in Cemetery Boys, and so he's considered to be an honorary brujo of sorts. He has the ability to see and interact with spirits, especially the spirits of past brujex. However, he's also seen magical dark spots, noticing shapes and creatures moving in the shadows, hearing strange whispers, and having disturbing visions that no one else can sense. That is, until he meets this non-binary bruja named Angel, who can not only heal the living and release the dead, but can also sense these same forms of darkness. Content warnings for some explorations of parent death and grief, some non-graphic allusions to child abuse of a secondary character, some references to experienced homelessness, and some depictions of injury and thematic violence. I don't want to say too much about this because we're still pretty far from the pub date, but also because I'm still very much processing the story. The fact that I've now read it and I'm on the other side of it is very surreal to me, and I'm still trying to wrap my mind just around that. But it's also a case of this series obviously meaning so much to me in a way that I can't really express, which makes it a lot more difficult to review in a lot of ways. Listen, it's been well established and well documented that I am anything but unbiased when it comes to this series, so feel free to take my thoughts with many grains of salt. But I had a great time with this, to say the very least. It's such a wonderful sequel that brings so much to the table and expands on the world and the character ecosystem that we were introduced to in the first book, and it does so in really thoughtful and exciting ways. Like I said, I love that this sequel is doing cool new things, expanding the concept of Brujex magic, and giving so many of the secondary characters we met in Cemetery Boys the space to really shine and contribute to the story. Honestly, I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about the POV change, but I actually really love the use of dual POV in the story. The majority is told from Julian's perspective, and it's really fun to be in his chaotic mind, but there's more of Yadriel's perspective than I thought there would be, and that's really nice, because then it doesn't feel like you're losing his voice or having to choose. I also really respect how the story does go to some very dark places, but also makes a point to show the characters experiencing softness and safety and joy. There are moments of respite and peace, which I think are not only very needed to balance out the story, but also present moments for the characters to revel in the community and the safe spaces that they've painstakingly built. And thematically, there's so much nuance that I simply cannot get into here and now, but there's really great conversations about how simply being in community isn't the same thing as being on the same page and working together towards the same goals. It's another really powerful love letter to the beauty and complexity of community, to breaking down barriers, to trusting each other even when it's scary, and to realize that holding fast to each other and working together is the only way we fight back the darkness. It's an incredibly timely story that I think we really need right now, for better or worse, and I just think it has so much to offer that, again, I really don't have the faculties to unpack in this moment. Again, I'm fully aware that I am the furthest thing from unbiased, but for what it's worth, I personally could not give this anything less than 5 stars. Penultimately, I picked up my e-galley of Behind 5 Willows by June Her, which is also coming out from Five Will and Friends on May 19th. This is June Her's homage to Pride and Prejudice, but set in the Joseon dynasty in South Korea. The main character, Haewon, is the second eldest daughter in a very poor family whose only chance at having a respectable life is to marry well. But even though she should be trying to avoid scandal and ruin, she secretly works as a book transcriber to make some extra money for herself. Keep in mind, this is also happening during a period of rampant government censorship where the writing and distributing of books has become illegal, especially as the empire fears the influx of Western anti-Confucius values and ideas, quote-unquote, destabilizing Korea. But Haewon is taken away from her work when her older sister begins falling for a wealthy young man, and Haewon is forced to act as their chaperone as they begin courting. But the young man's infuriatingly stoic and judgmental friend, Sojun, is also acting as chaperone. And what neither of them realize is that Sojun is one of the anonymous writers who Haewon transcribes for in secret. Content warnings for references to parent death, sibling death, and grief, experienced classism and sexism, and some references to suicide and attempted murder. This was one of my most anticipated 2026 releases, and honestly, June Her did not disappoint. In her author's note, she actually talks about how Pride and Prejudice inspired her to start writing in the first place, because the first thing she ever wrote was Pride and Prejudice fanfiction. And while this book is definitely a far cry from fanfiction, I think you can definitely feel that love and that reverence in how she put this story together. This is a really lovely homage to Jane Austen, but done in June Her's distinctive style. I am also a huge fan of Pride and Prejudice, so any book that likens itself to that classic in any way, shape, or form is a book I will definitely try. I don't care if it's a retelling, a reimagining, an homage, an inspiration point, I will show up, and chances are I will be very happy. I think this story strikes a really great balance between calling back to the original in ways that are clear and identifiable, but also being enough of a departure that it also very much stands on its own. Especially with the setting, the culture, and the completely different historical context, this story still has its own distinctive feel and is so much more than just a copy-paste of the original classic. I also have such a deep respect for June Her as an author because she is constantly carving out space to share these historical Korean stories in the YA market for young audiences who might not otherwise have interest in or access to this kind of history and these kinds of stories. I just love that she's so true to herself and her history and her culture in that way. And I really appreciate how this story excavates Korean history and shows how that history is not entirely unlike the present day history that we're watching unfold right before us. For instance, people think that book banning is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not. It's a very common play from the oppressor playbook. Historically, it's been a key component to the rise of fascist and authoritarian regimes, whether it's book banning, removing books, burning books, or even outlawing the creation of books. So I think there's always value in seeing how the issues we're facing today are not, in fact, unprecedented, even though it serves the oppressor for us to believe that these are unique experiences that we don't know how to fight back against. And with that being a key part of the plot, the story is also able to ask some really provocative questions about what it means to continue creating in a world and in a system that devalues creation itself. What is the value of storytelling when the act of storytelling is characterized as dangerous? Is joy, is escapism, is enrichment a good enough reason to persevere and take the risk? So I really appreciate those conversations happening in the story. And on top of that, I think the romantic tension between Haebon and Sojun is also absolutely delectable. And I really appreciate how the author is able to portray desire and romance while never losing sight of the realistic social constraints of the time period. So there's definitely a lot here to appreciate and enjoy. I do wish the romance was even more drawn out. I feel like things sort of escalate quickly in the end, and the way some of the subplots tie up was not quite as satisfying as I would have liked, but this was still wonderful. It only made me even more excited to dive even further into Junher's backlist, and in the end I gave this 4.25 stars. As if all that wasn't enough, I closed out the month by reading Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal by Mohammed El-Kurd. Mohammed El-Kurd is actually a Palestinian poet and journalist. His poetry collection, Rifqa, is one of the best collections I've ever read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. But this book is a collection of nonfiction essays exploring the systemic and calculated dehumanization of the Palestinian people specifically. It's analyzing how the perpetrators of genocidal violence are coddled, obscured, and protected, while the victims of that same violence, again, namely Palestinians, are blamed, vilified, and can only be mourned or even named if they're deemed as being good enough. Particularly with the ongoing genocide in Palestine, Palestinians are forced to prove their humanity and perform the role of the perfect victim as a justification for their grief, their loss, their despair. And here the author is explaining the systems of colonial power that keep this dynamic and expectation in place. Content warnings for graphic depictions of genocide and violence, descriptions of injury and death, explorations of racism, colorism, classism, and Zionist ideologies, and some brief references to torture, rape, and sexual violence. This book is nothing less than essential reading, in my opinion. The fact that Mohammed El-Kurd sits at the intersection of poetry and journalism makes this book even more powerful because it's able to build fact-based arguments supported by all kinds of key context, but it's also able to capture the imagination and drive each point home with very carefully considered language. These essays are painstakingly debunking Zionist and fascist rhetoric and really challenging the reader to reframe the quote-unquote burden of proof the media especially often places on the shoulders of Palestinians, on the shoulders of people who have lost so much, who have shouldered so much suffering and grief, and yet society and the media still demands that they justify their grief, that they exonerate themselves as good and innocent as a prerequisite to their own humanity. Whether we realize it or not, we're constantly putting Palestinians, and by extension all colonized people everywhere, on trial before we can see them as human, before we can see them as being deserving of grief and mourning, which is ultimately a tool of distraction and a tool of propaganda. When we criticize and dehumanize the colonized individual or a specific population, when we scrutinize the language they use to express their grief, when we don't place any value on any messages that don't come with all the correct caveats, when we demand that the colonized debase themselves in order to make themselves acceptable enough or legible enough by our own colonized standards, then we are missing the forest for the trees. By demanding and expecting that Palestinians perform their own humanity as if it were theater, we take the focus away from where it should be. We shouldn't be putting these colonized individuals, these people, under a microscope. It's the colonizing framework, the oppressive systems at play, the systemic racism and violence that dehumanizes, harms, and kills them that deserves our scrutiny, our outrage, our focus. It's been said many times by people far more intelligent than me, but the ongoing genocide in Palestine is a microcosm of the world. Not only is it a litmus test for what we as global citizens are willing to accept and willing to turn away from, but the US specifically also has direct ties to the IOF, and the tactics and technologies that the IOF use are very much influenced by and influencing our increasingly militarized militarized police forces and so-called border control forces. So these are not separate issues. These are not things happening in isolation. So if you've been newly horrified at the escalation of what ICE is doing in this country, then you should have been horrified at what's been happening in Palestine for decades. And what we're seeing here, the predominant narratives that catch the attention of the media and the way those narratives are told, comes from the same exact playbook as the Zionism at the heart of the Palestinian genocide. All oppression is interconnected, and I really appreciate this book for its clarity on that stance and for its willingness to force the reader to sit with that discomfort. Ultimately, this book is like the perfect meeting place between eloquence and rage. I respect that this author doesn't hold back, doesn't capitulate to the dominant narratives in order to establish trustworthiness, doesn't coddle the audience, doesn't start from a place of both sidesing the argument. There's a real feeling of cathartic release with each new topic. In the interest of transparency, I am filming this video before the end of January, and I still have about 50 pages left to read, but even so, I feel very comfortable wholeheartedly recommending this book, and I don't see a way that I rate this anything less than 5 stars. Like I said, it was a pretty eventful reading month. My reading definitely took me to a lot of different places, but those are all the books I read to start 2026. If you've read any of them yourself, or if you plan to, head down to the comments below and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.